Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. George Papaconstantinou as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before I get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Dr. George served as the chair of International Political Economy at the Florence School of Transnational Governance and is academic director of the Global Executive Master at the European University Institute. In economics by training, he earned his PhD from the London School of Economics and has built a career that bridges high-level policymaking, academic scholarship, and global governance. He has served as the forefront of public life in Greece and Europe as a cabinet minister, member of parliament, and member of the European Parliament. As Greece's finance minister during the Eurozone crisis and later as Minister of Environment and Energy, he led a far-reaching reform agenda spanning fiscal governance, revenue systems, market liberalization, state-owned enterprises, and strategic assets divestment. He has also played a key role in advancing Greece's transition toward clean energy and green economy. Earlier in his career, he worked as a senior economist at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, advised the Greek government on economic policy, served on the board of Greece's largest telecommunications company, and taught at the Athens University of Economics and Business. He has also consulted for the European Commission and leading international think tanks. Since leaving public office, his work has focused on economic policy, financial systems, and governance in an increasingly complex global landscape. At the Florence School of Transnational Governance, he teaches international political economy across both the Master in Transnational Governance and the Global Executive Master, and leads the Crisis Seminar, where recent global crises are examined comparatively. His research centers on the political economy of crisis, the evolution of global governance, and the dynamics of European integration. In today's episode, Dr. George Papaconstantinou joins us to unpack the central ideas from his book, New World, New Rules: Global Cooperation in a World of Geopolitical Rivalries, exploring how global governance is evolving amid shifting geopolitical dynamics with a focus on global public goods, economic interdependence, and deeper forms of international integration. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. George Papaconstantinou to the conversation. Professor George, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to you for accepting our invitation. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Professor, the book opens from a stark tension between the urgent need for collective action and the unraveling of the Bretton Woods era order. How do you explain this contradiction to someone who feels globalization has already gone too far?
I think it's important to start with a statement that to many may seem controversial, but it is very true. Globalization has been a force for good. Globalization has lifted millions from poverty, especially in the developing world. And even within the advanced economies, where there's now a backlash against globalization, globalization has been a force for good. Now, of course, not everyone has always benefited. There have been winners and losers, and what we're seeing today is indeed a backlash where loss of jobs, inequality are often blamed on globalization. I would argue that if you had two competing explanations, one being technology and one being globalization and international trade, technology is more responsible for the destruction of jobs and increase inequality than trade itself. However, it is true that we need to address this issue head on. To many people, globalization has gone too far. And that's what is interesting. And it is the beginning of our book, basically, where we say that we are more interconnected than ever before. And it is true, whether you're looking at trade or finance or climate or digital, we are more interconnected than before. But at the same time, the willingness to collectively solve problems is at a very low point. And that's a real challenge for the international community.
Dr. George, you and your co-author argue for a new agenda for global governance that is both ambitious and pragmatic. What, in your view, makes a global governance proposal pragmatic rather than utopian in today's geopolitical climate?
So it's very easy to look at today the great power rivalry, to look at the tariff rates, to look at the retaliation, to look at what is being said, and to lose hope that there can be what economists call collective action to resolve or to address global problems. But if you think about it, how can you have trade without rules? How can you have an effort to combat climate change without some kind of international cooperation? How can you deal with artificial intelligence without some framework that we all collectively agree to? How can you avoid future pandemics without some kind of organizations and rules that guide information and coordination? So it's not a question of whether we need this kind of mechanism. It's a question of how. And therefore, what we're trying to do in this book is to recognize that the environment does not favor large-scale global solutions in the way there's a lot of skepticism around particular organizations, there's a lot of skepticism around the rules of what we have come to call the multilateral order. At the same time, the reality of the situation calls for practical solutions. And what we're trying to do is to look at practical solutions in particular policy areas that range from the global commons to trade, finance, and what we call behind the border integration.
Professor, Bretton Woods institutions were designed for a very different world. If you had to pinpoint 2 or 3 core design flaws that makes this arrangement outmoded today, what would they be?
First of all, the Bretton Woods institutions only focused on a small subset of the issues that we should be thinking of collectively. They focused on trade and finance. They didn't really focus on investment. They didn't focus on taxation. And they left out a whole area which today is existential, and that's climate, it's health, it's the digital commons, what we call the global public goods. So I think I wouldn't say that was necessarily a design flaw because at the time the priorities were different. We were coming out of the war. It was a question of stabilizing the world economy, hence the institutions that were put in place. But today we know better. Today we know that maintaining the climate is something that is irreversible. If we fail to do it, there's no way back. Avoiding pandemics is absolutely crucial for humanity. Similarly with the digital sphere. So I wouldn't say that the fact that the original design left out the global commons was a flaw. It was not a flaw at the time. It is a flaw today. One flaw that I would say we should have seen and reacted to and changed is the fact that the original design was very much US centric, and the world has changed since then. We have had a pivot to Asia, not only China, but a number of India, other emerging economies have become big in the global system. And the way we're running this multilateral organization has not kept up with that. So the West, in the broad sense, I'm generalizing the West, but the US, European Union did not accept that they would have to share the way that these organizations were run, the posts, and that's why you've seen backlash also coming from the developing world, from emerging economies, where there have been alternative institutions that have been built up because they couldn't have a say to the institutions that were under the Bretton Woods system.
Professor, the book looks across climate, health, trade and competition, banking and finance, taxation, migration, and the digital economy. Which of these domains best illustrate what works in global governance today, and what lessons can be transferred to other areas?
So there's another paradox when you're looking at these kind of issues. It is that the policy areas where we have the most complete and legally binding environment, international trade is an obvious one, are also the ones where results are the poorest, where the most problems are. Other areas which don't have the legal underpinnings and the institutions to guide collective action, for example, taxation, international taxation, are ones where we have managed, or international banking regulation, are some where we have managed to actually get some things done in different ways, much more informal. So what we're saying here is that we're starting from a categorization between three broad areas. We say global commons, under which we put health, climate, and digital. Then we have what we call the channels of international interdependence, and there we put international trade, we put international finance, but also migration, because it is the flow of people, the labor flow, just as we have goods, services, and capital. And finally, what we call behind the border integration. And there we put banking regulation, taxation, and also competition. And we say that we find surprising successes in this third category, which is the one that is institutionally least complete. And from there, we look at how some organizations, such as the OECD, have in the area of international taxations, have managed to help abolish, for example, tax havens and abolish banking secrecy for individuals. They have had less success in corporate taxation, but these are some lessons of the way of working there in a more informal, less kind of legally binding way, where you can still get some results. And we hope that some of these lessons can be transferred to other areas.
Professor, conversely, is there one policy area among the seven where global governance has most clearly failed? And what does that failure reveal about the limits of current multilateral approaches?
Oh, clearly migration. Migration is the area where governance is the weakest. And that's because it's politically toxic. And the economic arguments for migration, which are very strong, are not enough to counteract political backlash against international migration. Look, even a very weak effort at putting some principles around migration, which was through the UN Global Compact on Migration, failed. The UN and some other countries, sorry, the US and other countries withdrew from that process. So this is an area in which I would say of all the ones that we're looking at is by far the weakest. And it is one where I don't have any hopes that anytime soon we're going to see much progress.
Professor, you talk about the need for governance solutions that embrace complexity, flexibility, and compromise. Precisely the traits many political leaders seem to resist. Can you share a concrete example from the book where such an approach has actually delivered results?
I can give you two. One I already mentioned, which is international taxation. Here, following the global financial crisis, global leaders in the context of the G20 gave the OECD the mandate to work on international taxation through a particular framework where not only OECD but non-OECD member states also participate. As a result, now, 20 years later, we have abolished tax havens in almost entirely, and we have abolished banking secrecy, and we have now an exchange of information for individuals, which means that tax evasion for individuals at an international level has been addressed to a large extent. Less so for the corporate sector, where we have not had much success and where current US resistance makes it even harder. A second example is banking regulation. Again, following the global financial crisis, you have a system of coordination amongst banks, which without any big international institution, except for the Basel Committee, which is an organization with the banks themselves, right? That puts rules for regulating banking services internationally that have managed to avoid the repetition of the same problems. Again, there are no fail-safe solutions. There are no magical solutions that we can simply take and repeat in other policy areas. But there are some good practices, and we should be learning from them.
Professor, core theme is managing global public goods in a world of structural rivalry between major powers. How can countries protect these global public goods when geopolitical competition increasingly weaponize trade, technology, and even currencies?
Well, let's take climate, for example. Yes, we are now in an environment where the US has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, and that is a problem. At the same time, the US is about 11, 12% of global emissions. So the rest of the world can continue working towards the goals of a green transition. And even within the US, there are many states, California being one, that want to continue that direction. And here you've got a coalition basically of business, civil society organizations, and some governments pushing in a particular direction. We are behind our goals, but it is a way to circumvent some of the politics of the moment. So I would say that climate is one area, health is another, and there we are finding ways to sidestep the WHO, which is dysfunctional at the moment. Perhaps the most difficult area is digital, and more particular AI, because there you have head-on rivalry between the US and China. And we're all increasingly understanding that we need rules for AI. We need a global governance framework for AI. And unfortunately, at the moment, these two powers do not seem to be, they're so caught up in the race between them that they're not willing to sit down and lay down rules. And that is, I think, one of the biggest dangers that we're facing at the moment.
Professor, the book discusses behind the border integration as a new frontier for cooperation. What does behind the border integration practically mean for national policymakers? And why is it so politically sensitive?
So we coined this term behind the border integration to capture the idea that often decisions by countries have what is called extraterritorial effects. And that is accepted by other countries. Let's take an example from competition, right? So the EU Competition Authority, which is the European Commission in effect, can actually block mergers that involve US companies, and that is accepted by the US, and vice versa. The US Competition Authority can block a merger or a takeover if they feel that it goes against healthy competition practices when it involves other firms that are not US based but are EU based. So we have over the years achieved this understanding that to the extent that we now have global firms, our global competition, and we don't have a global competition authority, the national competition authorities can coordinate among themselves and accept each other's jurisdiction and decisions. That is behind the border integration in the sense that this is not driven by one big international organization. This is national competition authorities that are coordinating amongst them in a network where they accept each other's way of doing business. So this has worked until now rather well. Now, of course, there is a danger that this is also going to be caught up in great power rivalry to the extent that competition policy now gets increasingly talked together with industrial policy. Countries may, and we are seeing this already in the US and the protection of its big tech companies, countries may put less of an emphasis on the competition aspect and much more on pushing their own companies on the global scene. So there will be a serious test of what we have achieved over all these years in competition. But that is an example of how you can have this behind the border integration, which is not controlled by national parliaments, let's say, or by one international organization, but which continues to work. And the other example that I gave before is banking. Through the Basel Committee of International Settlements, we do have a coordination that allows the large banks that trade internationally and are present around the globe follow certain particular regulatory practices, for example, in terms of capital adequacy. And if they don't, they have a reputation effect. And if they have a reputation effect, people take their money out, and that works, right? So that is a behind the border integration type practices, which is indeed a new frontier for cooperation.
Professor, you argue that today's governance arrangements are becoming more hybrid, mixing multilateral institutions, regional coalitions, issue-based clubs, and public-private networks. In the book, what do you identify as the most promising hybrid model and why?
So this is a very good question. And I would say that climate is a good example. Again, I'm not claiming that we are doing everything we should be doing to combat climate change. We are behind the Paris Agreement goals. We are not putting enough money on the table to help emerging economies to catch up because the West has been using non-renewables for a long time, and there's an issue of fairness there. So all this is true, but in climate, you have a situation where if you look at the framework for international cooperation, it's actually very weak because there is no institution that has the ability to compel behavior. There is no institution in trade. There is. It doesn't work, but there is. WTO has a tribunal, has a court within it, right? In climate, you cannot. You have individual voluntary pledges, and you hope that these all add together to something that makes a difference for climate change. And yet, it is a system that works. Why does it work? Because it has a very strong epistemic community, because we have very clearly identified the problem, and we, all of us, or most of us, agree that it is a serious issue that needs to be addressed, because business is behind it, and business is writing off very quickly the investments in brown technology and is switching to green technology, because China has made a huge pivot to this, to the extent that now Europeans are worried about what will happen to their car industry, for example, because of EVs and batteries and the like. But it has made a real shift, and China is very big and has been and is now coming to the point where it starts to reduce its use of non-renewable. So and because you've had a very strong civil society push, especially over younger generations, who believe that it is important to safeguard climate for the future. So you had this combination of a hybrid where you've got some institutions that are multilateral, you've got some regional coalitions, you've got clubs, basically, of coalitions of the willing that are pushing forward. You've got public-private networks, and this combines together in a way that was not in the rule book. In the rule book, you had one big organization that was driving this. That's no longer the case. So I would use climate again, even though it's clear we're behind where we should be. I would use climate as one of the most promising hybrid models.
Dr. George, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. In your concluding policy agenda, you and your co-author sketch how to navigate a fragmented yet interdependent world. If you had to translate that agenda into one or two actionable priorities for the next 5 years, what should policymakers tackle first?
I would single two things. The first is a question of priorities when we tackle all these issues. And there in the book, we argue that you've got to pay more attention to the existential stuff, meaning climate, health, digital. This is the stuff that if you lose it, you won't come back. If we completely miss our goals to keep temperature increase down, then it will be impossible to bring that back. If we don't manage to control future pandemics, we will go through continuous repeats of what we lived through with COVID-19. If we do not control AI, and if we don't have some rules, some guardrails for AI, some of the people themselves who have developed the new language models talk about existential threats, right? So the first thing that I would say is that we need to recalibrate our priorities and to put these digital commons first, and then worry not less, but in a different way about the traditional areas such as international trade and finance, where we can go with coalitions of the willing. We try as much as possible to use WTO rules, but in an environment that's going to be suboptimal. So the first thing I would say is recalibrate your priorities. The second thing, if I were to sort of single out one priority, I would say a governance framework for artificial intelligence in the next 5 years. And I would even say the next 5 years is way too long because we don't really know how close we are to a tipping point for AI. But we do know that and we've seen this in the discussions between particular AI companies and the US government and the US military. The use has got to be regulated, and we may need to take a pause or to establish the kind of framework that allows the use of AI for the public good and not for uses that we will regret. So I would put that as one specific priority that I would put forward for policymakers to do. Now, at the same time, I recognize that that's a very hard one, right? It's not an easy win, and it's not an easy win because of what I mentioned before. You have the rivalry between the US and China on this. The US is spending way more than China is. Europe is far behind those two, the rest of the world at this also. And at the same time, it is clear that in the US case, investment in AI, which may turn out to be a bit of a bubble, is propping up US growth. So it would be very hard to scale back on it. But we are doing it without taking into account the negative implications of uncontrolled AI. And I think that is a very, very dangerous road to take.
Thank you, Dr. George Papaconstantinou, for sharing such rich insights on how global cooperation can still be reinvented in an age of geopolitical rivalries. Your reflections on crisis, global public goods, and the future of governance offers a powerful lens for understanding the world we are stepping into, not just the one we are leaving behind. To our listeners, if you would like a deep diver insights, we encourage you to explore this book, New World, New Rules, Global Cooperation in a World of Geopolitical Rivalries. Thank you for joining, and we look forward to having you with us in the next episode. Thank you once again, Professor George, for sharing your time and your publication with us today. This has been a truly enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for having this conversation, which I hope has been interesting for your listeners.
Thank you.